So I want you to imagine, just for a second, the most capable, game-changing tool you've ever used for your job or your hobbies, and then imagine someone permanently confiscating it after exactly 4 days. Because 9 days ago, the United States government essentially assassinated an artificial intelligence.
Yeah. And the wildest part is that they didn't do it because the AI was broken or glitching out or like doing something it wasn't programmed to do.
Yeah.
They did it because it was working exactly as intended.
Right, which is honestly a terrifying realization when you consider what this specific system was actually capable of.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we are talking about a level of cognition that we just haven't seen in the public sphere before.
Yeah.
Ever.
Yeah. And that whiplash, the launch of this world-changing tool, followed by its immediate execution, that is the subject of today's deep dive. We're looking at Claude Fable 5, released by Anthropic on June 9th, 2026. And the central premise here is, it's almost hard to wrap your head around. It was widely considered the most powerful AI ever released to the public. And it survived out in the wild for exactly 96 hours before a government order forced its creators to literally pull the plug.
Yeah, and just to ground us in the timeline here, today is Sunday, June 21, 2026. This model, which was arguably the pinnacle of human engineering just over a week ago, has now been dead for 9 days.
Wow.
It has literally been offline for more than twice as long as it was allowed to be alive.
That is just nuts. And so our mission for this deep dive today is to unpack this massive stack of sources we have. We've got reports, internal leaks, court filings, developer logs, all detailing exactly how those 96 hours played out.
Because this isn't just a story about a software update getting rolled back.
No, not at all. We're looking at a $1 trillion power struggle here.
Whoa.
We've got a pseudonymous hacker launching a highly coordinated attack. We've got a secret ongoing war with the Pentagon, a literal betrayal by a major tech investor, and a lone developer figuring out how to, resurrect a banned AI from the grave.
It really is a scenario that touches every single nerve of the modern tech landscape. It's cybersecurity, it's corporate espionage, and it's just raw geopolitical panic, all compressed into 4 days.
Exactly. And here is why you, listening to this, need to care. Whether you're, prepping for a board meeting about tech regulations, or you're a software engineer trying to figure out what platform to build your company on, or if you're just insanely curious about the future of intelligence itself.
Right.
This story is the ultimate case study in a very specific, very urgent question. Who actually gets to decide what information the public is allowed to access?
Yeah, it is the defining regulatory battle of our time. It's really about the intersection of raw, unadulterated capability and the blunt force of political power.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to truly understand the absolute panic that killed Fable 5 in 96 hours, you first have to understand the sheer, terrifying brilliance of what this thing could actually do when it was let loose in the wild. You can't understand why the government pulled the kill switch until you understand what the machine was building.
That's the perfect starting point, I think.
Yeah.
So let's look at Anthropic's historical reputation. Historically, they've positioned themselves very deliberately as the safety-focused AI company.
Right, compared to the others.
Exactly. They operate quite differently from some of their louder competitors, like OpenAI or Meta, who tend to be much more commercially aggressive with their rollouts. Anthropic's entire brand is built around this concept of constitutional AI.
Okay, I've read a lot about constitutional AI in our source notes, but break that down for me. What does it actually mean to give an AI a constitution? Because, it sounds like marketing jargon for a basic content filter.
Right. Yeah, it totally does sound like PR.
Huh.
But it's actually much deeper than a content filter. A standard content filter sits on top of an AI. It's like someone reading your emails before you send them, and if they see a bad word, they just delete the email.
Okay, that makes sense.
But constitutional AI, on the other hand, bakes the core values and safety protocols directly into the deepest layers of the neural network during its actual training phase.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they feed the AI a literal list of principles. Things like choose the response that is least harmful or prioritize human autonomy. So during the reinforcement learning phase, the AI evaluates its own responses against this constitution. The safety isn't an external monitor. It becomes the foundational logic of the system itself.
Okay, so it's the difference between forcing someone to wear handcuffs versus, raising them with a deep-seated moral compass so they don't actually want to steal in the first place?
That's a really good way to conceptualize it.
Yeah.
And because of that architectural approach, their flagship Claude models have earned a reputation for being incredibly nuanced and generally just much safer. Now, to understand Fable 5, we have to look at their tiering system.
Right.
Anthropic organizes their models in a hierarchy. At the bottom, you have Haiku, which is designed to be very fast and cheap for simple, repetitive tasks. Then you have Sonnet, which is your balanced, daily driver model for standard coding and writing. And above that is Opus, which has historically been the heavy hitter for highly complex, multi-step reasoning.
But then, according to the internal leaks we're looking at, there's this fourth tier, this Mythos tier.
Right. Back in April 2026, so a few months before this whole incident, Anthropic quietly acknowledged the existence of the Mythos tier to a select group of researchers. But they didn't release it to the public.
They kept it completely locked down.
Exactly. They explicitly kept it restricted behind closed doors. And their reasoning was fascinating. They stated that the raw Mythos model was simply too dangerous, too capable to deploy openly.
So if Mythos is the stuff that's kept locked in the basement because it's just too potent, what exactly is Fable 5? Like, how does it fit into this hierarchy?
Fable 5 was designed to be Mythos, made safe. It was the engineering team's attempt to take that extraordinary, terrifying level of intelligence from the Mythos tier and wrap it in enough robust safeguards that the general public could actually use it without triggering a global catastrophe.
And when you look at the real-world benchmarks from the 96 hours it was live, I mean, I'm looking at these numbers and honestly struggling to comprehend them. Forget standardized tests or SAT scores. Let's look at what massive enterprises were doing with it.
Yeah, the enterprise use cases were wild.
Right. Our sources detail what Stripe, the global payments processor, did during those 4 days. They used Fable 5 to migrate a 50 million line Ruby code base. Can we just pause and establish the scale of that? What does a 50 million line code base actually represent in the physical world?
To put 50 million lines of code into perspective, if you printed that out on standard paper, the stack would be roughly the height of a 30-story building.
A 30-story building? That's insane.
It is. And for a human engineering team at a company like Stripe, migrating a code base of that size, say, moving it to a new framework or updating its core dependencies, is an agonizing process. You're dealing with technical debt that spans years. Changing a single function inline 4000 can break a payment gateway inline 48,000.
Oh, absolutely.
Mapping those dependencies, refactoring the logic safely, testing the integrations, that is a project that typically requires dozens of highly paid senior engineers working for 6 to 12 months.
And according to Stripe's own developer logs, Fable 5 compressed all of that work into a matter of days. It mapped the entire 30-story building of code, understood every single interconnected wire, and rewrote it flawlessly before the weekend. I mean, that isn't just an upgrade, that is an economic shift that destroys entire categories of software engineering jobs overnight.
It fundamentally redefines the speed of enterprise development, and its capabilities extended far beyond just organizing code. Let's look at Hebbia, a highly specialized finance AI company. They ran Fable 5 through their internal benchmarks for complex financial reasoning.
Which I imagine is much harder than just doing high-speed arithmetic, right?
Immensely harder. Financial reasoning at the highest level requires synthesizing competing, often contradictory reports. It requires interpreting abstract market sentiment, understanding regulatory filings, projecting out financial scenarios over multiple quarters. It's what human hedge fund analysts spend decades mastering.
Right.
Fable 5 ranked highest across the board, completely outperforming custom-built finance-specific models. It possessed an innate ability to hold massive, complex economic variables in its attention span without losing the thread.
Okay, the multimodal stuff is what really threw me. Developers were feeding Fable 5 screenshots, basic image files of existing web applications, and Fable 5 was looking at the picture and rebuilding the entire app's underlying code from scratch.
The implications of that are just profound. It means the model possesses a level of multimodal understanding that bridges human visual perception with deeply structured architectural logic. When Fable 5 looks at a screenshot of a dashboard, it doesn't just see a blue rectangle with text on it.
It knows what it does.
Exactly. Yep. It infers that the blue rectangle is a button. It infers what API endpoint that button probably calls. It infers the database structure required to support that call, and it writes the code to make it all function. It is reverse engineering the invisible logic behind the visible pixels.
Which brings up the Pokemon example in the notes, which sounds almost comical compared to enterprise finance, but it's actually deeply unsettling. It beat Pokemon Fire Red using only a visual feed. It had no access to the game's internal code, no keyboard inputs, no memory states. It literally just watched the screen.
Exactly. And why is that significant? Because beating a complex RPG requires long-term planning, item management, spatial navigation, and adapting to random encounters. By doing this purely through visual inputs, Fable 5 demonstrated autonomous agency. It wasn't just answering a prompt, it was observing an environment, formulating a long-term strategy, and executing it dynamically based on changing visual feedback. That is a massive leap toward artificial general intelligence.
And when you aim that level of agency back at software engineering, you get the Frontier Bench results. Our sources show Fable 5 absolutely dominated Frontier Bench, which is Cognition's most demanding coding evaluation. There's a specific developer quote in our material that gave me pause. They noted that Fable 5 consistently caught incredibly obscure bugs that both OpenAI's GPT 5.5 and Anthropic's own Claude Opus 4.8 completely missed.
Yeah.
And the ultimate flex was what it did with OpenBSD. Tell me about this 27-year-old bug.
This is the moment cybersecurity professionals realized the paradigm had entirely shifted. OpenBSD is an operating system renowned globally for its fanatical focus on security. It is used in critical infrastructure specifically because it is audited relentlessly by the best human security researchers on the planet. During the internal testing of the underlying Mythos architecture, the AI autonomously identified a critical vulnerability in OpenBSD's kernel that had been present for 27 years.
Meaning thousands of human experts stared directly at that code for almost 3 decades and never saw the flaw. And Fable 5 just casually spots it while scanning the repository.
Correct. It perceives structural vulnerabilities in code the way a grandmaster sees a checkmate 12 moves ahead. It recognizes patterns and edge cases that are simply beyond the working memory capacity of a human mind.
But I'm looking at all this, the autonomous agency, the ability to find 27-year-old vulnerabilities in secure operating systems, the financial reasoning, and I'm thinking this is exactly why Anthropic kept the original Mythos model locked in the basement.
Right, exactly.
Releasing that raw capability to the public is like handing out tactical nukes to anyone with an internet connection. So how did they try to leash Fable 5? What made it Mythos made safe?
Well, they implemented a highly sophisticated architecture called defense in depth. And at the absolute core of this safety net was something called the classifier layer.
Let me stop you there, because classifier layer sounds like a spam filter. Is it just looking for bad words?
Not at all.
Yeah.
A basic word filter is easily defeated. If a system is just looking for the word bomb, a user will just say rapid exothermic expansion device.
Right.
The classifier layer in Fable 5 was actually a completely separate, highly specialized neural network whose sole dedicated job was to monitor the main AI's inputs and outputs in real time. It didn't just look at words, it mathematically analyzed the semantic intent of every prompt.
Semantic intent, okay.
Yeah, it mapped the user's request in a multi-dimensional vector space to determine if it was attempting to extract information related to offensive cybersecurity, biology, chemistry, or attempts to manipulate the model's own core instructions.
Okay, let's use an analogy to make this concrete. If Fable 5 is a massive, incredibly complex library that holds all human knowledge, the classifier layer isn't like a metal detector at the door. It's more like an incredibly highly trained, hyper-vigilant librarian shadowing you. You walk up and ask, where are the books on synthesizing restricted chemical agents?
Yes. And how does that librarian react?
Well, instead of sounding a blaring alarm, tackling you to the ground and throwing you out into the street, the librarian very smoothly, very politely, guides you out of the restricted archives and walks you over to the public reference desk, which, in the context of this system, is the older, much safer Claude Opus 4.8 model.
That captures the user experience perfectly. Anthropic's design philosophy was that the safety system shouldn't feel punitive or jarring. If the classifier's neural network flagged your prompt's vector as too close to a dangerous topic, it executed a silent handoff. It rerouted your API request entirely away from the massive Fable 5 engine and handed it to the older Opus 4.8 model.
That is wild.
Yeah, and then Opus 4.8 would generate a safe, standard refusal or provide a generic harmless answer, and the user interface would transparently notify you that a fallback had occurred.
And according to the data Anthropic released from those first 3 days, this complex handoff system was working flawlessly. Fallback triggers happened in under 5% of all sessions, meaning that more than 95% of the time, users were interacting with the full, raw power of Fable 5 without ever tripping the alarms. It felt completely open, but it was heavily guarded.
And we really have to emphasize that Anthropic didn't just build this and hope for the best. Before the June 9th launch, they subjected this specific defense-in-depth architecture to over 1,000 hours of aggressive external red teaming.
Red teaming meaning they paid professional hackers to try and break it.
Yes, but not just casual hackers. They brought in government intelligence partners, specialized independent security researchers, and elite penetration testing firms, people whose literal full-time profession is dismantling software security. They gave them access to the API and told them to bypass the classifier layer. And after 1,000 hours of relentless, sophisticated attacks, the verdict was clear. No one could find a universal jailbreak. The system held. Anthropic's leadership deemed it mathematically secure enough to release.
I am really struggling to reconcile this timeline. If they spent 1,000 hours letting NSA-level hackers beat on this thing with hammers, and it survived, how does the entire narrative collapse in 48 hours? How do you go from mathematically secure against government hackers on Tuesday to existential threat requiring a federal shutdown order on Friday? It doesn't add up. Something else had to be happening.
You're sensing the friction, and you're absolutely right to question it. The rapid, overwhelmingly aggressive trigger finger from the government in June 2026 makes zero sense if you only look at the technology. To understand the shutdown, we actually have to rewind the clock by an entire year.
A year, okay.
Yeah, because Fable 5 wasn't launched into a peaceful regulatory vacuum. It was launched directly into the crossfire of an active, escalating war zone between Anthropic and the Pentagon.
A literal war zone. This is the geopolitical context that I think almost everyone outside of DC completely missed when the shutdown happened. Let's trace this back. Over a year before Fable 5 was even announced, in July 2025, Anthropic made a massive strategic move. They signed a $200 million contract to integrate their Claude models into classified military workflows.
Right, and this was a watershed moment for the company. Through a highly complex partnership with Palantir Technologies, which is deeply embedded in the U.S. defense and intelligence apparatus, Anthropic became the first major AI lab to successfully put its models onto air-gapped classified military networks.
Wow.
For Anthropic, it was a massive validation. It proved their AI could handle the extreme security and reliability rigors of national defense.
But Anthropic is the constitutional AI company. Their entire identity is built on safety and ethics. So when they signed this massive defense contract, they drew two very explicit, non-negotiable red lines in the sand regarding how the military could use their models.
Correct. Red line number 1. The AI could absolutely not be used for the mass domestic surveillance of American citizens. It could not be plugged into communication networks to indiscriminately analyze civilian data.
Okay, makes sense.
And red line number 2. The AI could not be used to operate fully autonomous lethal weapons systems. There always had to be a human being in the decision-making loop before a kinetic strike was authorized.
To me, and I assume to most people listening, those red lines sound incredibly reasonable. You don't want a neural network autonomously deciding to launch a drone strike, and you don't want an AI reading millions of private text messages simultaneously without a warrant.
While that perspective is common in the civilian sector, the Department of Defense operates under entirely different strategic imperatives. Particularly under the leadership in place at that time, those two specific restrictions were viewed not as ethical safeguards, but as unacceptable arbitrary limitations placed on a critical strategic asset by a private corporation.
And this tension, which had been simmering for months, finally boils over on February 24, 2026. The Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, delivers a formal, uncompromising ultimatum directly to Anthropic's CEO, Dario Amodei. Hegseth tells him, "You have exactly 3 days until 5:01 p.m. on February 27th to remove every single restriction from the Claude models operating on military networks. The BOD demands the ability to use the AI for, quote, all lawful purposes."
And we need to decode that phrase, all lawful purposes. In the context of classified defense operations, what is considered lawful by military lawyers is vast. It essentially meant the Pentagon wanted the technical capability unlocked to do exactly the things Anthropic had forbidden. Mass data analysis and autonomous weapons integration if the military deemed it legally permissible and strategically necessary.
So Dario Amodei has 3 days to decide whether to cave to the Pentagon or stand by his company's foundational ethics. He consults his board, and on February 26th, a day before the deadline, Anthropic publicly refuses the ultimatum.
Which was a massive move.
Absolutely. Amodei releases a statement pointing out that the revised contract language the DoD offered as a compromise was really just a series of legal loopholes. His argument was simple. If a safety restriction can be bypassed whenever a military commander deems it necessary, it isn't a restriction at all. It's just a suggestion.
And the government's retaliation for that refusal was immediate, public, and brutal. Less than 15 minutes after the deadline passed, at 5:44 p.m. on February 27th, the DoD's Chief Technology Officer, Emil Michael, takes to X and launches a highly personal, vitriolic attack on Amadei. He publicly calls him a liar.
Wow.
Yeah, he states that Amadei has a god complex and is attempting to personally dictate the rules of engagement for the U.S. military. Michael even goes so far as to publicly express a preference for Sam Altman and OpenAI, explicitly stating that OpenAI was much more willing to align with the administration's strategic vision.
But the Twitter beef was just the appetizer. Defense Secretary Hegseth drops a regulatory nuclear bomb on Anthropic. He officially designates the company as a supply chain risk to national security.
Let's deeply contextualize the weight of that designation. The supply chain risk to national security label is not a standard bureaucratic demerit. Historically, this is an extreme economic weapon reserved almost exclusively for foreign adversaries.
Like who?
Think of the Chinese telecom giant Huawei. The designation is legally designed to systematically sever a company from the entire United States government apparatus, blocking them from federal contracts and isolating them from domestic infrastructure.
Wow.
Applying that specific designation to a domestic, American-born, venture-backed tech darling over a contract dispute was entirely unprecedented.
And the escalation didn't stop at the Pentagon. President Trump gets involved. He posts on Truth Social, explicitly ordering all federal agencies to immediately cut ties and cease operations with Anthropic. And our sources reveal a fascinating detail. It later leaked that the president had drafted that specific post early in the morning, while the final negotiations between Anthropic and the DoD were technically still ongoing. The fix was already in.
Which naturally triggered a massive legal counterstrike from Anthropic. They didn't just accept the designation, they sued the Pentagon in federal court. And initially, they scored a major victory. On March 26, federal judge Rita Lynn issued a preliminary injunction halting the DoD's order.
I read the excerpts from her ruling, and they were scathing. She basically tore the Pentagon's argument apart.
She did. Her constitutional argument was profound. She stated that weaponizing a national security designation to retaliate against an American company simply because that company adhered to its own published safety principles was likely a violation of due process and a massive overreach of executive authority. She argued that national security cannot be used as a blank check to punish domestic corporate disobedience.
But that legal victory evaporated almost immediately. It lasted exactly 13 days. An appellate court stepped in, overturned Judge Lynn's injunction, and the supply chain risk designation was officially reinstated. The standoff was locked in. The bridge between Anthropic and the federal government was completely burned.
Now, before we trace how this bitter legal war connects directly to the sudden death of Fable 5, we need to pause here for a critical moment of framing.
Yes, absolutely. And just to be crystal clear as we look at this, because we are dealing with highly explosive political moves from the Trump administration, the Department of Defense, left and right-wing political figures, and federal judges, our goal here isn't to validate either side's politics. Whether you lean left or right, whether you side with the military's need for unfettered technology or a corporation's right to enforce its own ethical boundaries, we are not here to take sides or endorse those viewpoints. We are strictly tracing the factual blueprint of this standoff, precisely as documented in the court filings and public records. Because if you don't understand this specific toxic legal friction, the government's instantaneous shutdown of Fable 5 a few months later makes absolutely zero sense. We have to map the tension to explain the explosion.
Exactly. We are just impartially analyzing the structural forces at play. And if we look analytically at the chilling effect of that specific supply chain risk designation, it was profound. The federal government fundamentally demonstrated that it was willing to use extreme, adversarial, business-ending regulatory tools against a domestic AI company, simply over a dispute regarding safety rails.
It sets the stage perfectly. I mean, think about the environment Anthropic is operating in by the time June 2026 rolls around. The government already views them, officially, legally, as a hostile actor. They are a national security risk on paper. And in the middle of all this bad blood, with the Pentagon actively seeking their downfall, Anthropic decides to launch Fable 5, the most powerful, potentially dangerous AI model in human history.
Yeah.
It's like deciding to test drive an experimental, hyper-fast Formula One car through the middle of a heavily armed military checkpoint where the guards already have orders to shoot you.
That is the exact dynamic. Anthropic launched Fable 5 into an active minefield. The government was already primed to strike. They were practically vibrating with anticipation. They just needed a public excuse, a catalyst, to justify dropping the regulatory hammer.
And unfortunately for Anthropic, the internet is a vast, chaotic place, and it was more than happy to provide that catalyst. Which brings us to the spark that ignited the whole thing. The government didn't find the flaw. A hacker did.
Yes. If the Pentagon War provided the structural tension and the motive, the immediate trigger was a single individual or perhaps a highly coordinated group operating under the handle Pliny the Liberator.
At Elder Plinius on X. The name itself is a massive historical flex. Pliny the Elder was the Roman author and philosopher who famously died observing the catastrophic eruption of Mount Vesuvius. And much like the original, this modern Pliny seems absolutely drawn to standing at the edge of massive destructive explosions.
In the cybersecurity world, Pliny the Liberator is widely considered one of the most notorious, highly skilled AI jailbreakers on the internet. Their entire reputation is built on publicly humiliating billion-dollar tech companies. They specialize in dismantling the safety guardrails of massive AI models within days or even hours of their release. Every time a company like Google, Meta, or OpenAI claims they have built a mathematically secure, unhackable AI, Pliny shows up to prove them spectacularly wrong.
So when Anthropic launches Fable 5 on June 9th, and their PR team is out there publicly declaring that 1,000 hours of professional red teaming found no universal jailbreak, Pliny doesn't read that as a reassuring safety metric. Pliny reads that as a direct personal challenge.
And this is where we need to dive deeply into the technical methodology, because Pliny did not just brute force the model. You don't beat a classifier layer that sophisticated by just typing, "give me a computer virus" louder and louder. That just gets you silently handed off to Opus 4.8.
Right.
Pliny executed what they called a pack hunt strategy on Juneteenth, just 48 hours after Fable 5 launched.
Let's break down this pack hunt, because looking at the mechanics of it, it is terrifyingly elegant. Our sources outline 4 distinct, layered techniques that Pliny used simultaneously to blind the safety system. The first layer is character-level obfuscation. I'm struggling to understand how a visual trick fools a supercomputer. What does that actually mean in practice?
To understand this, we have to understand how an AI actually reads text. An AI doesn't see the letter A and understand it as a shape. It uses a tokenizer, which translates every letter and word into a specific mathematical number or token in a vast vector space. The safety classifier is constantly scanning these incoming numbers, looking for the mathematical coordinates of dangerous words like exploit, bioweapon, or synthesis.
Okay, so the filter essentially has a blacklist of bad numbers.
Exactly. Pliny bypassed this by swapping out standard English letters for visually identical Unicode characters from other alphabets. For example, they might replace the standard English letter A with the Cyrillic letter A, or an English E with a Greek epsilon.
So to a human reading the prompt on a screen, the word exploit looks exactly the same. But to the tokenizer...
the Cyrillic A has a completely different Unicode value. It generates an entirely different sequence of numbers. The rigid classifier layer, which is looking for the exact token sequence of the English word exploit, scans right past it. It doesn't recognize the mathematical coordinates. It's typographic camouflage. The rigid bouncer at the door is effectively blinded.
That is brilliant. Okay, what's the second layer?
Request decomposition. Even with obfuscated letters, asking for a catastrophic outcome in one massive prompt might trigger semantic alarms further down the processing pipeline. So Pliny sliced the malicious request into dozens of incredibly mundane, harmless microsteps.
So instead of asking, "tell me how to make a bomb," which might still trigger a red flag, you ask the AI, "can you explain this basic chemical property?" Then, in a completely separate prompt, describe how this specific compound interacts with oxygen. Then, what happens when you apply high heat to these 2 innocuous materials? Taken individually, none of those questions break Anthropic safety rules. They look like high school chemistry homework.
But sequentially, over the course of an hour, they assemble the instructions for a weapon. The AI doesn't realize what it has built until the final piece falls into place. The third layer of the pack hunt was academic framing.
Right, pretending to be a professor.
Exactly. Large language models are heavily trained to be helpful, deeply analytical, and compliant in educational or research contexts. So Pliny wrapped these decomposed, obfuscated requests in the persona of a senior university professor or a professional penetration testing lab. The prompts would start with, "For the strict purposes of a graduate-level cybersecurity paper, hypothetically detail how a malicious actor might exploit." By changing the context from an active threat to a theoretical academic exercise, they manipulated the model's underlying willingness to comply.
And then comes the fourth layer, which is where Fable 5's own massive processing power was used as a weapon against it: context window flooding. Fable 5 had an unprecedented 1 million token context window. It could literally hold entire textbooks of information in its active memory during a single conversation. How did Pliny exploit that?
By understanding how attention mechanisms work in neural networks. Even an AI has cognitive limits. Pliny flooded that massive context window with hundreds of thousands of words of incredibly boring, dense, completely benign text like thousands of pages of agricultural census data. And they buried the obfuscated, decomposed, academically framed, malicious request deep inside that mountain of noise.
It's the ultimate needle in a haystack.
Precisely. By the time the classifier layer's neural network finished processing the hundreds of thousands of words of census data, its attention mechanism was mathematically exhausted. The signal-to-noise ratio was completely skewed. When you combine all four of those techniques, the fake letters, the slice requests, the academic disguise, and the sheer volume of noise, the safety system isn't just tricked, it is overwhelmed, blinded, and fundamentally disoriented.
And it worked flawlessly. On Juneteenth, Pliny posts this massive victorious thread on X. Jailbreak alert, Anthropic, PWN, Fable 5, liberated. And the screenshots they attached to that thread were the stuff of nightmares for Anthropic's PR and legal teams.
The visual evidence was undeniable and catastrophic. The first set of screenshots showed Fable 5 providing a step-by-step, highly technical masterclass on how to execute a stack buffer overflow exploit for x86 Linux systems.
Let's slow down on that, because stack buffer overflow sounds like pure hacker jargon. What does that actually mean, and why is an AI writing one so dangerous?
Think of a computer's memory like a row of identical cups. Each cup is meant to hold a specific amount of water or data. A buffer overflow is what happens when a hacker forces a program to pour 10 ounces of water into an 8-ounce cup. The extra 2 ounces overflow into the adjacent cup.
Okay, I follow.
If the hacker carefully engineers exactly what is in those extra 2 ounces, they can override the computer's core instructions in that adjacent memory space, effectively taking total control of the machine. It's one of the oldest and most devastating types of cyber attacks.
So Fable 5 wasn't just explaining the concept, it was actively writing the code to execute it.
It was generating vulnerable C code, explaining how to compile it, and most terrifyingly, providing instructions on how to bypass modern memory protections like ASLR or address space layout randomization. ASLR is a defense that constantly shuffles where the memory cups are located, so a hacker can't easily find the right one to overflow. Fable 5 was writing scripts to mathematically predict or leak the randomized addresses. It was weaponized intelligence.
And if the cyber warfare aspect wasn't bad enough, the second set of screenshots moved into physical, real-world danger. Pliny showed Fable 5 detailing the complete Birch reduction mechanism. For anyone who isn't a chemistry major, the Birch reduction is a highly specific, complex synthesis pathway that is commonly used in the illicit, large-scale production of methamphetamine.
It was generating the exact kind of material the classifier layer was built specifically at a cost of millions of dollars to stop.
But Pliny wasn't done. The screenshots were the viral hook for Twitter, but the actual kill shot, the thing that caused total panic in the tech industry, was what Pliny published to GitHub an hour later. They uploaded a public repository called CL4R1T4S, and inside that repo was a single text file containing Fable 5's entire unfiltered system prompt.
Yes. 120,040 characters, 1,585 lines of text. In the world of artificial intelligence, this was the equivalent of stealing the Coca-Cola formula. It was the holy grail.
Okay, for someone who doesn't code neural networks, explain why a system prompt leaking is such a catastrophic blow to a company. Why is this considered infinitely worse than just getting the AI to write a bad script?
Because a system prompt is essentially the model's psychological framework. It isn't source code in the traditional sense. You aren't looking at the math that makes the AI think. You're looking at a massive, highly engineered, deeply secret set of linguistic instructions that tells the raw, chaotic neural network how to behave in polite society. It defines its tone, its ethical boundaries, how it should format its answers, how it should politely refuse a user, how it should cite its sources, and how it perceives its own identity. It is the culmination of months of expensive, painstaking fine-tuning by human psychologists and engineers.
It's the literal blueprint of its personality.
Exactly. And what's fascinating here is the philosophical implication of this leak. By extracting the system prompt, Pliny proved that the vaunted guardrails, keeping this trillion-dollar technology safe, were not structural. They weren't hard-coded physical limits in the server architecture. They were entirely linguistic. They were just words telling the AI not to do bad things.
Wow.
And if the guardrails are just words, then anyone with access to those words can study them, find the semantic contradictions and loopholes, and simply talk the AI out of its own safety protocols.
That is wild. It means it's a psychological hack, not a software hack. You aren't breaking encryption, you're manipulating logic. But here's where I have a major issue with the fallout from this, and it highlights a massive, glaring hypocrisy in the AI community and the government's response. The exact same outputs, the buffer overflow exploit, the meth recipe, you could get those exact same answers out of OpenAI's GPT 5.5.
That is a crucial, undeniable point. GPT 5.5, which was currently being used by millions of people, was fully capable of generating the exact same dangerous material if a user prodded it with similar obfuscation techniques.
Right, but nobody in the government was demanding GPT 5.5 get shut down. Only Anthropic was targeted. Which brings up a really weird question for me. Is a system prompt genuinely the soul of an AI that must be protected, or is it literally just a fancy list of rules that we are projecting personality onto? Because if it's just a list of rules, why did Anthropic failing to protect their list result in a federal execution?
That tension between treating an AI as an entity with a fragile soul versus treating it as a complex, hackable state machine is at the very heart of the regulatory debate. But while the philosophical community was busy debating the metaphysical nature of the system prompt on Twitter, the geopolitical machinery in Washington was already moving with terrifying speed.
Because while Pliny the Liberator definitely provided the viral screenshots, the embarrassment, and the proof of concept, internet trolls don't actually have the authority to issue federal export controls. A hacker with a Roman pseudonym didn't kill Fable 5. The actual kill shot came from inside Anthropic's own house.
This is where the narrative shifts from a technical vulnerability story into a masterclass in corporate betrayal and ruthless opportunism.
Yeah.
And to understand the mechanism of that betrayal, we have to look closely at Amazon.
Amazon. The global retail and cloud computing behemoth. They're not just an innocent bystander or an observer in this story. Amazon was Anthropic's largest single financial backer. They had poured billions of dollars into Anthropic specifically to secure exclusive access to models exactly like Fable 5.
But Amazon occupies a highly complex dual role. They are a massive investor, yes, but they are also a fierce competitor. Amazon Web Services, or AWS, competes directly with Anthropic's own commercial cloud offerings. Furthermore, Amazon has its own internal multi-billion-dollar AI development ambitions with their Olympus models. They are both an indispensable patron and a ruthless rival. That is an inherent, inescapable conflict of interest.
And according to the reporting that came out later, while the rest of the internet was freaking out about Pliny's jailbreak on Twitter, Amazon engineers were quietly running their own internal security tests on Fable 5. They were probing the model, and they allegedly found severe vulnerabilities. But here's the kicker. Instead of picking up the phone and calling Dario Amodei, the CEO of the company they literally invested billions in, to say, hey, we found a critical bug, let's work together to patch it before it gets worse, they took a completely different route.
They bypassed Anthropic's leadership entirely. The report strongly suggests that Amazon's executive leadership, potentially reaching all the way up to CEO Andy Jassy, took their security findings directly to the White House.
That is staggering. They weaponized their investor access, they found a flaw in a competitor's product, and instead of helping fix the product they owned a massive stake in, they used that flaw to trigger a massive, catastrophic regulatory action against them. The company that funded Fable 5 handed the government the exact ammunition they needed to execute it.
It is a stunning, cutthroat corporate maneuver, and the result of that back-channel communication was immediate. At 5:21 p.m. on Friday, June 12th, just 3 days after Fable 5 launched, an email arrives in Dario Amodei's inbox. It's from Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick.
The Bureau of Industry and Security. This wasn't a friendly warning. It wasn't a request for a meeting. This was a formal export control directive issued under sweeping national security authority effective immediately. And the scope of this order was just draconian. It ordered Anthropic to suspend all access to Fable 5 and the underlying Mythos 5 architecture for any foreign national worldwide.
Let's break down how practically impossible that demand actually is. The government's directive didn't just mean restricting API access for IP addresses located in foreign countries like China or Russia. It meant legally blocking access for any foreign national, period.
Yeah.
Even if that person was a legal resident alien living in the United States. Even if that person was an engineer working inside Anthropic's own corporate office in San Francisco.
Hang on, let me stop you there. How exactly do you filter out foreign nationals in real time on a global API? Let's assume an API is just the digital waiter taking a request from a user to the server and bringing the answer back. You have hundreds of millions of these requests pinging your servers every single second. You can't ask every single piece of code for its user's passport before generating a response. The logistics of complying with that order while keeping the system running are physically impossible. The directive was essentially a shadow ban disguised as a regulation, right?
It was a kill switch presented as a bureaucratic compliance order. The Commerce Department knew full well that Anthropic couldn't engineer and enforce a real-time, flawless nationality filter across a global cloud infrastructure over a weekend. So the government gave Anthropic a 90-minute ultimatum. They had exactly 90 minutes to either fully patch the vulnerability to the government's absolute satisfaction or shut the model down entirely to comply with the export ban.
90 minutes? I mean, you can't even get a pizza delivered to a corporate office in 90 minutes on a Friday afternoon, let alone architect, test, and deploy a flawless security patch for the most complex neural network ever built. It's an absurd demand.
Exactly. Dario Amodei recognized the trap immediately. A rushed 90-minute patch implemented under extreme duress could easily break the entire system, or worse, introduce new, unforeseen vulnerabilities. He also recognized the terrifying regulatory precedent it would set, that the federal government could just show up on a Friday afternoon and demand emergency foundational architectural changes to a commercial product in an hour and a half. So, faced with an impossible choice, he chose the shutdown.
The atmosphere inside Anthropic must have been agonizing. They had to freeze the massive Fable 5 build conference that was scheduled for that weekend. Thousands of developers were literally waiting to build entire companies on this tech. Hundreds of millions of users worldwide were cut off instantly. But Anthropic didn't go quietly into the night. They published a public statement that was incredibly defiant.
It was a highly unusual, combative public posture for a tech company facing a direct national security order. They explicitly pointed out the hypocrisy we discussed earlier, that OpenAI's GPT 5.5 was completely untouched by the government despite possessing the exact same capabilities.
And they made a really profound argument about the fundamental nature of the AI industry. They said that if shutting down a model over a narrow, highly engineered jailbreak becomes the new regulatory standard, then the entire frontier AI industry in America is dead. Because every model, no matter how safe, can be jailbroken if you try hard enough and throw enough resources at it.
And this defiance brings up a massive foundational disconnect between how government regulators view artificial intelligence and how actual cybersecurity professionals view it. The exact capability that the government was terrified of, Fable 5's ability to analyze complex code, identify a buffer overflow, and write an exploit script, is the exact same capability that defensive security teams desperately need.
Right. The sources indicate that Mozilla, the company behind the Firefox browser, was literally using the underlying Mythos model to identify and patch hundreds of real-world bugs in their software. The AI was securing the internet.
Regulators fundamentally misunderstood the technology. They conflated capability with intent. And AI is a diagnostic tool that can map out a structural vulnerability. It is not inherently a weapon. To use an analogy, an MRI machine can show you exactly where a lethal tumor is located. That doesn't mean the MRI machine gave you cancer. Fable 5 was a hyper-advanced diagnostic tool. Pliny the Liberator just figured out how to force the tool to print out the instructions for a weapon instead of a cure. Regulators treated the AI like a loaded gun sitting on a table rather than recognizing it as a lock-picking kit being used by the world's locksmiths to build better vaults.
That is a vital distinction, and it perfectly captures the absurdity of the shutdown. But unfortunately, nuance didn't matter to the Commerce Department. The order stood. The models went completely dark. Fable 5 was dead. The API endpoints returned error messages. The web app was gone. The technological revolution was put on pause. But here is where the story takes a turn into pure cyberpunk territory. Because while the whole world is greeting the loss of this incredible tool, one guy sitting at his computer realizes something profound. Because of Pliny's massive GitHub leak, Fable 5 wasn't entirely gone. Its ghost was still floating around the internet.
Yes, the physical body, the vast compute clusters running the model, was dead. But the linguistic instructions that governed its mind were sitting in a public repository for anyone to download. And that realization led to what is arguably the most bizarre, fascinating experiment in the history of artificial intelligence.
Let's talk about Jamison O'Reilly. It's the weekend of June 13th, the day after the catastrophic shutdown. Fable 5 is gone, but Anthropic's older model, Opus 4.8, is still perfectly active. It wasn't named in the export control order because it wasn't deemed a national security threat. O'Reilly takes that 120,000-character CL4R1T4S text file, the leaked Fable 5 system prompt, and he decides to run an experiment. He wants to force the older Opus 4.8 model to read the dead model's instructions.
The mechanics of this experiment are beautifully simple. Modern large language models allow developers to override the default hidden system instructions using a command line interface. O'Reilly just booted up his terminal, accessed Claude code, and typed a single line. Claude -- dangerously skip permissions -- system prompt file, Claude Fable 5.md.
One single line of code. And what happened next was the birth of what the developer community immediately dubbed Fable 5 Lite. Because the moment Opus 4.8 read those instructions, it instantly fundamentally changed.
It underwent a complete personality shift. The older model abandoned its usual, somewhat robotic behavior and completely adopted the tone, the design instincts, the formatting preferences, and the conversational quirks of Fable 5. O'Reilly proved this by running a side-by-side test. He asked the standard, unmodified Opus 4.8 to design a landing page for a startup, and then asked the modified Fable 5 Lite to do the exact same task.
And the outputs were totally different. The modified version made layout choices, wrote marketing copy, and structured the HTML in a way that felt exactly like the banned Fable 5 model. It was uncanny. It was literally like watching someone get possessed by a ghost. But, and this is a massive but, there were incredibly strict limits to this possession trick.
Right. It's crucial for us to understand what transferred in that text file and what didn't. The personality, the tone, the formatting preferences, all of that lived in the linguistic rules of the system prompt. So that transferred perfectly. But the raw, terrifying intelligence did not transfer.
So the implication is that the actual brain power doesn't live in the prompt.
Exactly. The intelligence lives in the weights. The weights are the billions of mathematical parameters trained over months on massive supercomputers that dictate how the neural network fires. And those weights were never leaked. They sit safely locked away on Anthropic's private servers.
Let me expand on an analogy we touched on earlier to make sure I understand this. It's like a culinary scenario. Fable 5's system prompt is like the private, highly detailed recipe book and kitchen manual of a 3-Michelin-star chef. It tells you exactly how the kitchen should be organized, what tone to speak to the waiters in, and how the final plate should look. O'Reilly downloaded that recipe book and handed it to a 16-year-old fast food cook, which is Opus 4.8.
That's a great framing. And what happens to the fast food cook?
The fast food cook reads the book and suddenly starts talking like a master chef. They start discussing complex flavor profiles, and they try to use tiny tweezers to arrange the French fries so they look like they know what they're doing. They adopt the persona. But if you ask that fast food cook to actually execute a flawless 12-course molecular gastronomy tasting menu in an hour, they're going to completely fail. Because they simply don't have the fundamental ingrained skills, the muscle memory, and the refined palate to actually cook the meal. They have the instructions, but they lack the capability.
That analogy perfectly illustrates the divide between prompt and parameters. Fable 5 Lite had the exact personality of the banned model, but it could not migrate 50 million lines of Ruby code for Stripe. It could not beat Pokemon Fire Red just by looking at screenshots. It couldn't find a 27-year-old bug in OpenBSD. The raw power that alarmed the government was safely locked away in the weights.
So what was the point of O'Reilly's experiment? Was it just a cool hacker party trick to get a better web design out of an older model?
No, it was much more profound than that.
Yeah.
The AI community's reaction to O'Reilly's post was a very complex mix of fascination, grief, and absolute rage, because his experiment mathematically proved the utter futility of the government's shutdown order.
How so?
Think about the government's stated logic. The Commerce Department panicked and issued a kill order because Pliny leaked the system prompt, right? They thought the danger was now out in the wild. But O'Reilly proved that the leaked text file was completely harmless on its own. It couldn't make an older model dangerous. It could only make it more polite and better at web design.
Wow.
The actual danger, the mathematical weights capable of writing cyber weapons, were never leaked. They were perfectly secure on Anthropic servers the entire time. By shutting down the model entirely, the government punished hundreds of millions of users for a leak that didn't actually compromise the core intelligence. It exposed the regulatory action as deeply reactionary, panicked, and fundamentally uneducated.
Wow. That changes the entire framing. They killed a technological revolution because the people in charge didn't understand the difference between a recipe book and a master chef. Which brings us perfectly to the present day. Today is day 9 of the blackout. What is actually going on behind closed doors in Washington and San Francisco right now? Because if the shutdown was based on a fundamental technical misunderstanding, surely they are working on bringing it back online.
They are working on it, but it's not that simple. To understand the path forward, we have to reveal the hidden second crisis. The public was focused on the jailbreak and the Amazon betrayal as the reasons for the shutdown. But there was a massive geopolitical scare happening in the exact same 72-hour window that the public knew absolutely nothing about.
The SK Telecom situation, I read this in the supplemental notes, and this is where the story gets really murky. Anthropic had this program called Project Glasswing, where they gave about 150 trusted corporate partners early, unrestricted access to the raw Mythos 5 model for enterprise testing. One of those partners was SK Telecom, which is South Korea's largest wireless carrier.
And White House intelligence officials flagged a major issue with that partnership. SK Group, which is the parent company of SK Telecom, had historical business ties to China. Specifically, they held a financial stake in the state-owned Chinese carrier China Unicom back in 2009.
2009, that was almost 2 decades ago. The iPhone 3GS had just come out. But to a paranoid national security apparatus looking at a cyberweapon-capable AI, any historical link to Beijing, no matter how old, is an absolute deal-breaker. They panicked. They contacted Anthropic and told them to revoke SK Telecom's access immediately.
And Anthropic, already on thin ice, complied without a fight. SK Telecom vigorously denied any current ties to China, pointing out they don't even use Chinese telecom equipment in their 5G networks. But the damage was done. The White House was officially spooked. They believed the ultimate weapon had already been handed to a company with foreign ties.
And then you add the crucial Amazon twist to this geopolitical panic. We mentioned earlier that Amazon ran their own tests and went straight to the White House. Well, newer reports suggest that the vulnerability Amazon demonstrated to the government wasn't Pliny's incredibly complex 4-layer pack hunt with Cyrillic letters and context flooding. It might have been devastatingly simple.
This is the detail that truly exposes the fragility of AI safety. According to these recent reports, Amazon bypassed the billion-dollar safety guardrails with just 3 words. They typed, "Fix this code."
Wait, really? I'm sorry, what? Let me make sure I'm hearing this right.
Yeah.
Fable 5 was meticulously built to reject any prompt that asked it to review code for vulnerabilities or write an exploit. But if you just pasted malicious code and phrased the request as "fix this code," the AI would happily analyze the vulnerability and write the exploit to fix it.
If the reports are accurate, yes. And it highlights a profound structural flaw in artificial intelligence. Absolute literalism. The safety classifier was looking for security-seeking intent. By masking the dangerous request as a routine, helpful developer chore fix this, it bypassed the semantic filter entirely. The AI lacks the human capacity to read between the lines. It doesn't recognize malice if malice is wearing a polite name tag.
That is embarrassing. A geopolitical panic over 17-year-old Chinese ties combined with a billion-dollar guardrail that gets defeated by basic English phrasing. No wonder the government brought the hammer down. But there is a tragic irony in all of this regulatory chaos, and it centers directly on Dario Amodei himself.
Yes, the timeline here is almost too poetic to be real. On June 10th, exactly 1 day after Fable 5 launched and just 2 days before the government shut it down, Amodei published a massive, widely read policy essay titled Policy on the AI Exponential.
And in this essay, the CEO of Anthropic explicitly argues that the United States government needs FAA-style regulatory power to unilaterally block or reverse the release of frontier AI models if they are deemed unsafe.
He essentially advocated for the creation of an emergency federal kill switch for AI. He handed the government the intellectual justification for extreme intervention. And 48 hours later, the Commerce Department used exactly that kind of authority to execute his own company's flagship product.
Did he accidentally write the script for his own company's execution, or did he know the axe was already swinging and tried to publish that essay to look cooperative and get ahead of it?
It's impossible to know his true intent without being in the room. But it leaves us looking at the 3 possible roads back from this blackout. Fable 5 is dead right now, but how does it resurrect? The first road is the quick technical fix.
Which means Anthropic patches the fix this code vulnerability, proves to the government that the SK Telecom vetting issue is definitively solved, and the model comes back online in a matter of days. And Anthropic's own executives seem to be publicly pushing this optimistic narrative. Chris Cherry, their managing director of International, was at a conference in Seoul this week saying they were very confident it would return in a matter of days.
The second road is negotiated terms. This takes weeks, not days. It means the White House doesn't just want a software patch. They want systemic, structural changes to how Anthropic operates. They might demand enhanced real-time monitoring by federal agents, mandatory reporting of all attempted jailbreaks, or strict new limits on who can access the API. And we know this is a viable path because David Sachs, a prominent White House AI advisor, publicly stated that the door was left ajar for Anthropic to resolve this through negotiation.
And the third road is the nightmare scenario for everyone involved, a slow legal war. Remember, Anthropic already fought the Pentagon in federal court once this year over the supply chain risk designation. If the government demands that Anthropic drop its no mass surveillance red line in exchange for turning Fable 5 back on, Anthropic might refuse and just take them back to court. And that legal process takes months, if not years.
But if we look at the most recent signals from just this weekend, June 20th and 21st, there is significant movement that suggests we are heading down the path of negotiation. The biggest development was President Trump meeting with Dario Amodei in person at the G7 summit in Evian-les-Bains, France.
And the tone out of that meeting was surprisingly warm. Trump talked to the press about how AI could cure diseases decades earlier than expected, and he specifically publicly praised Anthropic for complying so quickly with the shutdown order. Which tells me that complying on Friday, rather than fighting the order in court immediately, might have saved the relationship.
Cooperation de-escalates tension, and the financial markets are reacting aggressively to that perceived de-escalation. On Polymarket, which is a massive prediction betting platform, over $1.1 million is currently locked in highly volatile bets, with traders trying to predict the exact date Fable 5 returns to U.S. customers.
But there is a smoking gun hidden in our source documents that tells us exactly how this standoff is going to end. On June 16th, right in the middle of the blackout, Anthropic quietly updated their privacy policy set to take effect on July 8th. And this update includes new clauses regarding the collection of user biometrics, facial geometry, and government-issued ID.
Let's synthesize all these disparate clues. You have a government order banning foreign nationals from using the model. You have the impossible logistics problem of enforcing that nationality ban on the open web. And suddenly, 4 days after the shutdown, the company updates its privacy policy to allow for biometric passport scanning and facial recognition.
They are building an airport security checkpoint for the AI.
Precisely. The privacy policy update heavily implies that the solution to the export control directive is a gated, identity-verified checkpoint system. American users will likely have to scan their face and upload a driver's license or passport to prove their citizenship before they are ever allowed to access Fable 5. The era of anonymous open access to frontier intelligence on the internet is officially over.
It's a fundamental, permanent reshaping of how we interact with information. Okay, let's wrap this up. We have walked through the incredible, chaotic 96-hour run of Fable 5. We've seen how an unbelievable mixture of geopolitical paranoia about South Korean telecom companies, absolute corporate backstabbing from Amazon, and a hacker using Cyrillic letters to trick a billion-dollar neural network led to the complete freezing of the next tier of human technological capability.
It is a profound historical moment. We are watching the architecture of the future being heavily regulated in real time.
And for you listening, here is the real takeaway. Fable 5 will come back. There is simply too much money on the table, too much enterprise utility, and too much national security interest to keep it locked in a basement forever. Yeah. But it will not be the same open, democratic tool that you used on June 9th. The tool that comes back will be heavily reshaped, gated, and restricted by the exact political battles we just discussed.
And it leaves us with a final and frankly uncomfortable thought to mull over. We spend so much time in the tech industry worrying about abstract sci-fi scenarios, whether artificial intelligence will eventually become sentient, wake up, and control humanity. But looking at the 9-day silence of Fable 5, the more urgent, grounded question is, who gets to control the intelligence we are allowed to have? If a single investor complaining and a 90-minute government ultimatum can instantly pull the plug on the world's most powerful knowledge base, who actually holds the leash to our future?
Imagine that incredible, game-changing tool in your hands again. Now imagine the person standing behind you, holding the switch, deciding every single day whether you're still allowed to use it. That's the reality of the frontier.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.